On February 16, 2009, a nauseating stench drifted from a desolate wasteland in the Liangqing district of Nanning, China. Curious passers-by investigated the smell and discovered heavy, black plastic bags leaking a dark, viscous fluid. Inside, they did not find trash, but the dismembered remains of 3 sisters who had vanished without a trace days earlier. What seemed like a random act of brutality would soon unveil a neighbor's twisted obsession and a killer hiding in plain sight. Before we enter the crime scene, please consider subscribing to support our investigations. It was February 12, 2009, the lingering tail end of the Lunar New Year festivities. The city of Nanning, the capital of the Guangxi region, was still draped in the red lanterns and festive energy of the Spring Festival. In the local police station, the atmosphere was uncharacteristically calm. Officers sat together, warming their hands around cups of hot tea, enjoying a rare moment of peace before the city returned to its chaotic, grinding rhythm. But that tranquility was shattered the moment the station doors burst open. A middle-aged man rushed into the precinct, his face a mask of sheer panic. He was out of breath, his chest heaving violently as he tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, pleading for help. The officers, sensing the gravity of the situation, set down their tea and approached him, offering water and urging him to breathe. After several agonizing minutes, the man composed himself enough to speak, though his voice trembled with a father's worst nightmare. He introduced himself as Tan Min, a 55-year-old man from the Liangqing district. He looked at the officers, his eyes welling with tears, and delivered a sentence that would launch one of the most harrowing investigations in Nanning's history. "Please," he begged, "you have to help me find my daughters. All 3 of them. They are gone." To understand the weight of this disappearance, investigators needed to understand the Tan family. Tan Min and his wife had 4 daughters in total, a house full of life and ambition. The eldest daughter, Tan Xiaomei, had been the trailblazer. Years prior, she had left their rural hometown and migrated to Nanning alone, embodying the floating population of workers seeking better lives in the metropolis. Through sheer grit and determination, Xiaomei had succeeded, eventually opening her own clothing boutique in the Hepping Shopping Center, a bustling commercial hub in the city. Xiaomei's success became the foundation for the rest of the family. Wanting to lift her parents and sisters out of rural poverty, she eventually moved the entire clan to Nanning. Xiaomei, independent and fiercely protective of her privacy, lived alone. However, she had rented a separate apartment for her parents and another unit specifically for her 3 younger sisters to share. These 3 sisters, Tan Jiami, Tan Yashan, and Tan Zhaoping, were the ones currently missing. The second sister, Tan Jiami, was known for her steadiness and sharp mind. She was Xiaomei's right hand, managing the Hepping boutique with a level of professionalism that made her the rock of the family business. The younger 2, Yashan and Xiaoping, were different. They were vibrant, social, and eager to enjoy the city life. With financial help from their eldest sister, they had opened a smaller clothing shop of their own. But unlike the work-focused Jiami, Yashan and Xiaoping were butterflies. They loved the nightlife, frequently visiting karaoke bars and dance clubs, and they had a wide circle of friends and male admirers. They were modern young women who embraced the online world, often chatting with strangers on the internet and meeting up with them offline, a habit that, in hindsight, sent a chill through the investigators. The 3 younger sisters shared an apartment in room 703, Block B of the Jiazhou Garden Complex. It was a standard, older residential building, the kind where neighbors lived close but often knew little about one another. The timeline of the tragedy began on the evening of February 10th, 2009. It was a Tuesday. The entire family had gathered at the parents' home for a post-New Year dinner. It was a warm, boisterous meal, filled with the sounds of chopsticks clinking and laughter. Around 8 in the evening, The eldest sister, Zhao Mei, announced she had to leave early. She had a business trip to Guangdong province to source new inventory for the shop and needed to catch a train. The three younger sisters stayed a while longer, chatting with their parents. As the night deepened, they too stood up to leave, needing to catch the last bus back to their apartment in Jiazhou Garden. Before walking out the door, Yashan and Xiaoping made a specific promise to their father. They told Tan Min that they would come back the next morning, around 9 o'clock, to pick him up. They wanted him to see their new shop and give advice on the renovations. The second sister, Jiami, also chimed in, promising she would swing by the shop the next morning to check on the progress. The door closed behind them. It was the last time Tan Min would ever see his daughters alive. The next morning, February 11th, Tan Min sat in his living room, dressed and ready. 9 o'clock came and went. The hands on the clock ticked past 10, then 11. He stared at his phone, waiting for it to ring. He tried calling Yashan. No answer. He called Xiaoping. It went to voicemail. He called Jiami. Silence. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. It was completely out of character for Jiami, the responsible manager, to be unreachable during business hours. Panic rising, Tan Min called his eldest daughter, Xiao Mei, who was already in Guangdong. Xiao Mei tried to soothe him, suggesting they might have overslept or left their phones on silent. But after hanging up, she too felt the creeping tendrils of fear. Xiao Mei immediately called the landline of her boutique in the Heping shopping center. No one picked up. She called the neighboring shop owner. "Is Jiami there?" she asked breathlessly. "Is the shop open?" The neighbor's reply made her blood run cold. "No, the shutters are down. Nobody has been here all morning." For Xiao Mei, this was the red alert. Jiami was disciplined. She never missed a day of work without notice. Something was wrong. Abandoning her business trip, Xiao Mei rushed to the train station and bought the first ticket back to Nanning. By the morning of February 12th, there was still zero contact. The family reunited and drove straight to the Jiazhou Garden complex. As they pulled up to the building, they saw a glimmer of hope. The electric bicycles the sisters used for commuting were parked in their usual spots downstairs. They must be home, Xiao Mei reasoned, her heart pounding. If the bikes are here, they haven't gone out. The family raced up the stairs to the 7th floor. Xiao Mei, who had a spare key, jammed it into the lock of room 703 and swung the door open. "Jiami? Yashan?" Her voice echoed into an empty apartment. The silence in the room was heavy and oppressive. The family moved through the space, looking for clues. The beds were neatly made, the quilts folded with military precision. On the computer desk, they found 385 yuan, about $56, sitting alongside their bank cards and national ID cards. Their mobile phone chargers were still plugged into the wall. Everything screamed that they had not intended to leave for long. You do not go on a trip without your ID, your money, or your phone charger. They checked the bathroom. The exhaust fan was whirring, humming a monotonous drone. The washing machine was full of clothes, soap powder added, ready for a cycle that had never been started. But the plug had been pulled from the socket. On the floor lay a pile of dirty laundry, turned inside out, as if just discarded. It was a classic locked room mystery scenario. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood spray on the walls. The windows were shut. The door had been locked from the outside. If they had gone on a trip, why leave their money? If they had been abducted, where was the struggle? Desperate, Tan Min went to the police, leading to the scene in the station. However, the initial police response was dishearteningly bureaucratic. The officers at the station saw no evidence of foul play in the apartment. There was no blood, no forced entry. To them, it looked like 3 grown women had perhaps gone on a spontaneous trip or were avoiding family. They told the Tan family to go home and wait. They are adults, the officers reasoned. Give it a few days. But the family could not wait. By February 14th, Valentine's Day, the sisters had still not surfaced. Xiao Mei, realizing the police were not prioritizing the case, turned to the media. She contacted local newspapers and television stations, broadcasting the missing persons notice far and wide. The story of the 3 missing sisters went viral on local social media forums. Nanning was a safe city. 3 women vanishing from their apartment without a trace was terrifying. If the girls were safe, they would have seen the news. They would have called. The silence was the only answer the family received. 2 more days passed. The calendar turned to February 16th. While the Tan family prayed for a miracle, 2 scavengers were walking through a desolate, undeveloped stretch of land in the Liangqing district, near the newly built Chaoyang town. This area was a ghost town of construction projects and overgrown weeds, rarely visited by anyone other than those looking for scrap metal. As they picked their way through the rubble, a pungently sweet, rotting smell assaulted their noses. It was the undeniable scent of decay. Curious, they followed the odor to a cluster of bushes where they spotted several large, black plastic bags. The bags were bulging, their contents straining against the thin polymer. The scavengers approached, thinking perhaps someone had illegally dumped spoiled meat from the market, a common, albeit disgusting, practice to avoid disposal fees. But as they got closer, the smell became unbearable, a thick miasma that clung to their clothes. They noticed a dark red liquid seeping from the bottom of one bag, pooling in the dirt. Flies were swarming the plastic in a thick, buzzing cloud. One of the men felt a shiver of primal fear but reached out to prod the bag. The plastic tore slightly. He leaned in, squinting. Inside, he saw what looked like chunks of meat, just pork. He muttered, trying to reassure himself. Someone threw away rotten pork, but then he shifted the bag and the contents rolled. 2 round, dark objects stared back at him. They were unmistakably human eyes. The men scrambled back in terror. This was not a sanitation issue. They dialed the Nanning Police Bureau immediately. When the police arrived, the atmosphere shifted from routine patrol to a major crime scene operation. Officers cordoned off the wasteland. Forensic experts, dressed in white protective suits, carefully approached the bags. They opened the first one. The stench was so overpowering that even seasoned officers had to turn away and gag. Inside the first bag, mixed with the unrecognizable flesh, were 2 human hands. They were severed at the wrist. The forensic team continued their grim work, unearthing bag after bag. They found a second bag containing 2 more hands, 2 feet, and a human head. The head belonged to a woman with long yellow-dyed hair. However, the roots were black, indicating the hair had grown out since the dye job. A small, sad detail of a life interrupted. Her face was swollen and decomposing, distorted beyond immediate recognition, but the features were undeniably female. In total, the police recovered 9 bags scattered across the wasteland. It was a jigsaw puzzle of horror. They cataloged 3 female heads, 6 hands, and 6 feet. The torsos and limbs had been chopped into small, unrecognizable fragments. Notably, the medical examiners made a chilling observation. The internal organs were missing. The killer had seemingly removed and disposed of the organs separately, likely to accelerate decomposition, or perhaps to reduce the volume of the remains for easier transport. The skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma, indicating the victims had been bludgeoned before or during the dismemberment process. The pieces were taken back to the morgue. The investigators, now realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately connected this discovery to the missing persons report, filed by Tan men 6 days earlier. The timing, the number of victims, and the gender all matched. Police drove to the Tan residence and picked up Tan Min and his wife. The drive to the morgue was silent, filled with a suffocating dread. When they arrived, Tan Min was asked to look at the remains. Despite the decomposition, a father knows his children. Through the swelling and the trauma, he recognized the features of his daughters. He collapsed, 90% sure that the nightmare had come true. To be absolutely certain, DNA samples were taken. The results came back swiftly, confirming the family's worst fears. The remains belonged to Tan Jiami, Tan Yashen, and Tan Xiaoping. The medical examiner estimated the time of death to be roughly 5 to 6 days prior, coinciding exactly with the night of February 10th, the night they vanished. The Tan family was destroyed. The mother fainted repeatedly. The father was a shell of a man. But for the police, the case had just shifted gears violently. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a triple homicide, and the brutality of the dismemberment suggested a killer with extreme cruelty and potentially anatomical knowledge or a butcher's skill. A special task force was immediately assembled. They returned to the sisters' apartment in Jiazhou Garden. This time, they did not just glance around. They tore the place apart. The apartment had been disturbed by the family during their frantic search, complicating the forensic work. But the experts went over every inch of the floor with luminol and magnifying glasses. Finally, they found it. Minute. Almost invisible traces of blood were discovered in the crevices of the floor tiles. The killer had cleaned, and cleaned well, but nobody cleans perfectly. The presence of blood confirmed that the apartment, their sanctuary, was the primary crime scene. The sisters had not been abducted from the street. They had been slaughtered in their own home. The investigation faced immediate hurdles. Jiazhou Garden was an older complex. It had no surveillance cameras in the hallways or the stairwells. There was no digital eye to tell the police who had entered or left room 703 on that fatal night. The police were flying blind. They began canvassing the neighbors. Door to door, they asked if anyone had heard screams, struggles, or strange noises on the night of February 10th. The results were frustrating. The walls were thick enough, or the neighbors were indifferent enough, that no one reported hearing anything suspicious. The residents were largely disconnected, living in the bubbles of their own lives. Furthermore, nearly a week had passed. Memories were fading. However, the lack of forced entry led the detectives to a chilling profile. The killer was likely someone the sisters knew, someone they trusted enough to open the door for, or someone who had a key. As news of the dismemberment horror spread, panic gripped the Jiazhou Garden complex. Residents packed their bags and fled, terrified that a maniac was living among them. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case before the city of Nanning lost its mind. Investigators turned their attention to the sisters' social circle. They knew Yashan and Xiaoping were active in the nightlife scene and had complex relationships. They began mapping out every person the women had interacted with: friends, ex-boyfriends, casual dates, and business associates. The list was overwhelming. Between the three sisters, the police identified nearly 1,000 distinct contacts. It was a logistical nightmare, but amidst this sea of names, one man stood out. A man with a violent reputation and a recent, volatile history with the sisters. His name was Wu Zhaoyi. The investigation into the gruesome triple homicide of the Tan sisters had shifted from a missing persons case to a hunt for a savage predator. With no forensic evidence pointing to a forced entry, detectives from the Nanning Police Department operated under the chilling assumption that the killer was someone the women knew, someone they had welcomed into their home. Scanning the social circles of Tan Yashan and Tan Xiaoping, investigators faced a daunting list of nearly 1,000 acquaintances. The two younger sisters had lived vibrant, chaotic lives, frequently engaging with strangers online and immersing themselves in the city's nightlife. However, as police filtered through the noise, one name began to flash like a warning light: Wu Zhaoyi. Wu Zhaoyi was a 30-year-old man living in Nanning, residing only a 15-minute motorcycle ride away from the sisters' apartment in Jiazhou Garden. On the surface, Wu presented himself as a small-time merchant running a modest construction material shop, but investigators quickly peeled back this thin veneer of respectability. His shop was merely a front. In reality, Wu was a loan shark and a pimp, a man who thrived in the gray areas of the law. His primary income came from predatory lending and facilitating prostitution, using his business connections to recruit young, attractive women from karaoke bars and nightclubs into his stable. The police zeroed in on Wu after a close friend of Tan Xiaoping came forward with disturbing information. According to the friend, the sisters had recently been living in fear of this man. The relationship had started innocently enough. Yashan and Xiaoping, young and fashion-conscious, frequented the local discos and karaoke lounges after closing their clothing shop for the night. They enjoyed the attention their beauty commanded and were open to making new friends. It was in this neon-lit environment that they met Wu Zhaoyi. Charming, well-dressed, and projecting an image of wealth, Wu easily ingratiated himself with the sisters. They were initially drawn to his charisma and his apparent success, unaware of the violence lurking beneath his polished exterior. The friendship took a dark turn when Wu invited Yashan and Xiaoping on a trip to a coastal resort. He framed it as a fun getaway, a chance to relax by the ocean. Trusting him, the sisters agreed. However, upon arriving at the hotel, the reality of the situation became terrifyingly clear. Wu had booked separate rooms for the women, but when they entered, they did not find empty suites. Instead, they found older, wealthy male clients waiting for them. It was a setup. Wu Zhaoyi had attempted to traffic them, selling their time to his associates without their consent. Panicked but resourceful, Yashan and Xiaoping managed to escape the hotel and flee back to Nanning. Outraged and terrified, they went to the police station to report Wu's actions. Officers detained Wu for questioning, but in a frustrating turn of events common in such cases, there was insufficient physical evidence to hold him on serious charges. He was released shortly after. But Wu Zhaoyi was not the type of man to forgive a slight. According to the sisters' friend, Wu began a campaign of harassment. He called them repeatedly, threatening retribution for going to the police. In the days leading up to their disappearance, Xiaoping had received multiple menacing calls from an unknown number, which she was convinced belonged to Wu. She had even told her friend that she was considering moving out of the Jiazhou Garden apartment because she feared for her life. Technicians pulled the call logs and confirmed that Wu Zhaoyi had indeed been in frequent contact with the sisters. The motive was strong: revenge, silencing a witness, and the violent rage of a predator whose ego had been bruised. As detectives built their case against Wu, they received a critical witness statement that seemed to seal his fate. The witness was a neighbor living directly across the hall from the sisters in room 704. His name was Lan Xingcheng. Lan Xingcheng appeared to be a model citizen, a young, educated man. He spoke to the police with a calm, helpful demeanor. He told investigators that on the night of February 10th, the night the sisters vanished, he had seen something suspicious. According to Lan, around 10 o'clock in the evening, he spotted a man loitering in the hallway outside the sisters' apartment, room 703. Lan described the stranger as being about 30 years old. He noted that the man was wearing a hat pulled low and a surgical mask covering his face, obscuring his identity. Lan claimed he had watched the man for about 10 minutes, intending to call building security, but the stranger eventually walked away and left the building. When police showed Lan Xingcheng a photograph of the prime suspect, Wu Zhaoyi, Lan nodded thoughtfully. He told the officers that while he had not seen the man's face clearly, the height and build of the man in the hallway were very similar to Wu Zhaoyi. This identification was the catalyst the police needed. To them, the narrative was complete. Wu Zhaoyi, the vengeful pimp, had come to the apartment, disguised in a mask to silence the women who had humiliated him. A tactical team was dispatched to Wu Zhaoyi's residence. They were ready to apprehend a violent killer. However, when they stormed the house, Wu was gone. His wife, trembling, told the officers that her husband had left Nanning 6 days ago. He went to Shanxi province, she stammered. He left on the 10th of February, the day of the murder. To the police, this looked like a classic flight from justice. Wu had killed the sisters and immediately fled across the country to hide. Detectives tracked Wu's movements to Shaanxi, a province over 1,000 miles away. They contacted local authorities and launched a manhunt, expecting to find him laying low. They eventually located him, but the arrest did not bring the satisfaction they had anticipated. Upon interrogation, Wu Zhaoyi admitted he was indeed a criminal. He confessed that he had traveled to Shaanxi to recruit, or rather, traffic young women from rural villages for his prostitution ring. However, he adamantly denied killing the Tan sisters. To prove his innocence regarding the murder, Wu produced irrefutable alibis. He had train tickets, hotel receipts, and, most importantly, eyewitnesses who were with him in Shaanxi at the exact time the medical examiners determined the sisters were being killed in Nanning. The timeline was watertight. Wu Zhaoyi was a predator and a criminal who deserved prison for his other crimes, but he was not the butcher of Jiazhou Garden. The lead dried up instantly. The police were back to square one. For the next 68 days, the investigation stalled. The Special Case Squad worked tirelessly, expanding their dragnet to unprecedented levels. They questioned over 30,000 people in the surrounding districts. They inspected more than 2,000 vehicles. They revisited the crime scene, the dump site, and the sisters' social networks. Yet, not a single viable lead emerged. The city of Nanning remained on edge. The image of those black plastic bags in the wasteland haunted the public consciousness. Rumors swirled that a gang was responsible, a syndicate that could make 3 people vanish and reappear in pieces without leaving a trace. Residents of Jiazhou Garden continued to move out, unable to sleep, knowing a monster might still be walking the corridors. The pressure on the police was immense. The case became a hot topic on internet forums, with amateur sleuths debating theories and dissecting the few details released to the public. In the midst of this digital noise, a specific comment on a local forum caught the attention of the investigators. While the majority of netizens were arguing that this was a professional hit by a triad gang, one user offered a different, more chilling perspective. The comment read, "Everyone keeps saying this was a gang. But if it was a gang, surely the sisters would have had enemies powerful enough to hire a group. That seems unlikely for 3 girls selling clothes. In my opinion, the killer is a single person. He is someone who knows the victims well. He is familiar with the building. He might even live in the same complex, perhaps the same tower, or even on the same floor." The comment was highly rated by other users, but to the police, it resonated for a different reason. It aligned with their initial profile, the one they had abandoned to chase Wu Zhaoyi. The lack of forced entry, the comfort the killer had in dismembering bodies inside the apartment, it all pointed to a neighbor. Reinvigorated by this logic, the task force decided to circle back to the Jiazhou Garden complex. They would re-interview everyone, starting with those closest to room 703. Naturally, they returned to Lan Xincheng, the helpful neighbor across the hall. When detectives knocked on his door for a second time, Lan was just as polite and cooperative as before. He invited them in, offered them water, and answered their questions with a steady, calm voice. He repeated his story about the masked man. He expressed his horror at what had happened to the nice girls across the hall. The detectives observed him closely. Lan Xincheng was young, slender, and wore glasses. He had the air of an intellectual, perhaps a bit socially awkward, but entirely harmless. He did not look like a man capable of overpowering 3 women. He certainly did not look like a man capable of the butchery required to chop 3 human beings into small fragments. "He is too calm," one detective noted later. "If he had killed 3 people and was living across from the crime scene, his psychological state should be fraying, but he is rock solid." Evaluating his demeanor and his physical stature, the police once again ruled him out as a suspect. It seemed impossible that this mild-mannered man could be the monster they were hunting. Desperate for a new angle, the forensic team returned to the only physical evidence they had: the bags. They laid out the grisly collection of evidence in the sterile lab. Most of the bags used to dispose of the bodies were standard, black heavy-duty garbage bags, the kind available at any supermarket. They offered no clues. However, as the examiners sifted through the layers of plastic, they noticed something unique about one of the bundles. To ensure the bags did not leak or tear, the killer had double-wrapped some of the remains. In one specific instance, inside the outer black plastic, the killer had used a woven bag, a durable white sack often used for carrying rice or construction debris. This specific bag was old and worn, but the printed red text on its side was still legible. The detectives leaned in, reading the faded characters. Nanning Vocational and Technical College. It was a generic school bag, the kind often given to students during orientation to carry their bedding or books. Thousands of these bags existed. They were cheap, durable, and common. Finding the owner would be like finding a needle in a haystack. A student could have thrown it away. A parent could have reused it for groceries. A scavenger could have picked it up. But it was a lead. The police immediately went to the college. They learned that these bags were indeed part of the standard welcome kit sold to incoming freshmen. They were used to hold quilts and uniforms. The investigators requested a list of every male student who had enrolled in the college over the last decade, who currently lived in the Liangqing district. It was a massive data dump, a spreadsheet containing thousands of names. The team began the tedious process of cross-referencing these student names with the resident list of Jiazhou Garden and the list of people they had already interviewed. They were looking for a match, someone who had attended that specific college and lived near the victims. As the computer algorithms crunched the data and the officers scanned the printed lists, one name suddenly jumped off the page, freezing the blood of the lead detective. It was a name they knew well, a name they had cleared twice. The name on the student roster was Lan Xincheng, the helpful neighbor across the hall, the man who had provided the description of the masked suspect, the man who seemed too weak to kill, was a graduate of Nanning Vocational and Technical College. He had enrolled in 2004. He would have received that exact bag during his freshman year. The realization hit the task force with the force of a physical blow. The killer had been staring them in the face the entire time. He hadn't just watched the investigation. He had actively participated in it, feeding them false leads to send them chasing after a loan shark while he sat in his apartment, mere feet from where he had slaughtered 3 women. The suspect was no longer a ghost. He was the boy next door. The realization that the killer had been hiding in plain sight, living just across the hallway in room 704, sent a shockwave through the investigation team. Lan Xincheng was not just a neighbor. He was a graduate of the very college identified on the evidence bag. He fit the profile perfectly. A single male living alone, geographically close enough to transport bodies without a vehicle, and intelligent enough to play the role of a concerned witness. However, knowing he was the killer and proving it were 2 different things. The police needed a confession, and to get that, they needed to break him. The detectives reviewed the transcripts of their previous interactions with Lan. In hindsight, his behavior stood out like a beacon. In a building where most residents were terrified and eager to help the police catch a monster, Lan had been strangely reticent. While other neighbors poured out every detail they could remember, Lan offered only brief, calculated responses. During one previous interview, he had even displayed a flash of arrogant impatience, asking the officers why they kept summoning him if they had no new leads. It was the hubris of a criminal who believed he had outsmarted the system. On the morning of February 25, 2009, the police summoned Lan Xincheng to the station for the 9th time. Lan arrived with the same practiced calm he had worn during the previous 8 interviews. He sat in the interrogation chair, adjusting his glasses, looking every bit the harmless, educated young man. He likely expected another round of routine questions about the masked man he had fabricated. The lead detective sat opposite him, placing a thick file on the metal table. For a long time, he said nothing. He just stared at Lan. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, designed to make the suspect's mind race. Lan shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes darting to the file. "Do you recognize this?" the detective asked finally, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution image of the woven white bag found in the wasteland, the one stamped with the logo of Nanning Vocational and Technical College. Lan glanced at the photo. For a split second, a flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes. His hands trembled imperceptibly before he clasped them together to steady himself. He recovered quickly, shaking his head. "I do not know what that is," Lan said, his voice steady. The detective leaned forward. "Take a closer look, Lan. You went to this college. You enrolled in 2004. Every student gets one. Are you saying you never had one?" Lan realized his mistake immediately. Denying knowledge of a standard school item was suspicious. He pivoted. "Oh, that bag. Yes, of course. I had one when I started school years ago, but that was 5 years ago. I have no idea where it is now. I probably threw it away. Why does it matter? Thousands of people have that bag." The detective smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It matters because this specific bag was used to wrap the dismembered remains of your neighbors. And here is the interesting part. Lan, we never told the public about this bag. We never released a description of it. Yet, when I showed you the picture just now, you looked terrified." Lan tried to speak, to offer another excuse, but the detective raised a hand to stop him. "You can stop the act, Lan. We are not just guessing. While you are sitting here, my team is in your apartment." Lan's face went pale. "We found traces of blood in your bathroom." The detective lied a bluff to push him over the edge, though they were confident they would find something. "But more importantly, we checked the drainage pipes. You cleaned your floor, Lan, and you cleaned it well. But you forgot about the drain. We found human tissue caught in the S-bend of your pipe. We ran the DNA." The detective slammed his hand on the table. "It matches the 10 sisters. It is over. We know what you did." The bluff about the drain was a gamble, grounded in forensic probability, but it struck Lan with the force of a sledgehammer. The wall of arrogance he had built crumbled instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. His composure shattered. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, and began to sob. It was not a cry of remorse, but the terrified wail of a man who realized his life was over. "I did not mean to," he stammered through the tears. I was so angry." Over the next few hours, Lan Jingcheng poured out a confession that was as pathetic as it was horrifying. He detailed the creation of a monster, a narrative not of a mastermind, but of a sad, angry failure who lashed out at the world. Lan Jingcheng was born on June 1st, 1985, into a well-to-do family in Nanning. His father was a government official, a man of status and high expectations. From a young age, Lan was burdened with the pressure to succeed, to uphold the family name. However, he was an average child, lacking the academic brilliance his parents demanded. This mediocrity created a rift between father and son that would fester for decades. Despite his poor grades, his parents used their resources to support him. In 2004, hoping to give him a stable foundation for his studies at the vocational college, they purchased the apartment in Jiazhou Garden Room 704. It was a gift, but it also came with strings attached, the expectation that he would make something of himself. Lan graduated in 2007, but the real world was unforgiving. He secured a job at a local company, but was fired almost immediately for incompetence. Shane prohibited him from telling his parents. He spent the next 2 years unemployed, living off his parents' support while pretending to be a functioning member of society. He became a recluse, spending his days in the apartment, isolated and resentful. The psychological dam broke during the Lunar New Year of 2009, just days before the murders. Lan's parents had come to the apartment to visit him for the holiday. Instead of a warm family reunion, it was an inspection. His father, seeing the messy state of the apartment and his son's unkempt appearance, exploded in rage. "Look at this place," his father had shouted, gesturing at the clutter. "It is a pigsty. You live like an animal. You are filthy." The verbal abuse became personal. His father poked a finger at Lan's chest. "And look at you. You are fat as a pig. You are useless. If you keep living like this, do not expect us to come back. You are an embarrassment." The insults did not stop there. On the morning of the next day, his father woke him up by kicking the bed. "Get up. You sleep like a pig too. Look at you. You are so ugly and lazy. No woman will ever want you. You will die alone." Lan Xincheng stood there, taking the abuse, seething with a lifetime of suppressed inadequacy. He argued back, a screaming match that ended with his father storming out of the apartment. Left alone in the silence of room 704, Lan Xincheng unraveled. The words pig, useless, and no woman will want you echoed in his mind on a loop. He felt emasculated, stripped of his dignity. He hated his father, but he could not kill his father. He needed a target for his rage. In this volatile state, Lan sought escape in the darkest corners of the internet. He spent the day watching violent pornography, fueling a twisted mix of sexual frustration and aggression. The line between reality and his dark fantasies began to blur. He decided he was going to prove his father wrong. He would take what he wanted. He would dominate someone. His initial target was his own girlfriend. In a confession that chilled the detectives, Lan admitted he planned to invite her over, hold her hostage, and assault her to assert his power. He went to a hardware store and purchased a terrifying kit, a folding knife with a razor-sharp blade, a hammer, and a canister of pepper spray. He returned to his apartment, weapons in hand, ready to call his girlfriend, but fate intervened in the cruelest way possible. As he stood by his door, he heard laughter in the hallway. He looked out the peephole and saw the Tan sisters Yashan and Xiaoping returning home. They were beautiful, vibrant, and full of life. Everything Lan felt he was not. He had watched them from afar for months, nursing a jealous infatuation. They were the swans to his pig. Seeing them happy while he was miserable sparked a sudden, explosive shift in his target. Why settle for one victim when he could take revenge on the symbols of everything he coveted? He watched them enter room 703. The plan formed in his mind instantly. He knew the layout of their apartment because it was a mirror image of his own. He knew that the fuse box for each unit was located in the hallway. It was 9 o'clock in the evening on February 10th. The hallway was quiet. Lan Xincheng stepped out of his apartment, dressed in dark clothes. He walked to the electrical panel on the wall and located the switch for room 703. He flipped the switch. Inside room 703, the lights died. The television cut out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. Lan moved to the door and waited in the shadows. Inside, the sisters were confused. Yashan, the younger and more spirited one, grabbed her phone for a flashlight and opened the door to check the fuse box, assuming a circuit had tripped. As she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, Lan Xincheng lunged. He clamped a hand over her mouth and forced her back into the apartment, kicking the door shut behind him. He brandished the knife, the blade glinting in the beam of the phone light. "Do not make a sound," he hissed. Inside, Xiaoping screamed when she saw the man dragging her sister. Lan moved with the adrenaline of a man possessed. He sprayed them with the pepper spray, blinding them and choking their screams. While they were incapacitated, coughing and weeping, he bound their hands and feet with rope he had prepared. He had total control. But the night was not over. Minutes later, a key turned in the lock. It was Tan Jiami, the second sister, arriving to visit them. She opened the door, unaware she was walking into a slaughterhouse. As she stepped across the threshold, Lan was waiting behind the door. He struck her immediately, overpowering her before she could comprehend what was happening. Now, he had all three of them. The sisters, terrified and bound, tried to reason with him, They offered him money. They offered him the cash on the desk, their bank cards, anything to leave them alone. "We won't tell anyone," they begged. "Just take the money and go." But robbery was never the motive. Lan Jingcheng did not want money. He wanted dominance. He wanted to inflict the pain he felt onto someone else. He looked at them, the beautiful neighbors who represented a world that had rejected him, and he felt no pity. Lan admitted to the police that he sexually assaulted them. After he had satisfied his twisted desires, the reality of the situation set in. He knew that if he let them live, they would go to the police. His father was a government official. A rape charge would destroy his family's reputation and prove his father right that he was useless trash. He decided there would be no witnesses. One by one, Lan Xincheng strangled the sisters. He watched the light fade from their eyes, cementing his transformation from a failed son into a triple murderer. When the apartment finally fell silent, Lan did not flee. He stayed with the bodies. He sat in the dark with his victims, catching his breath. Then, the cold, pragmatic side of his nature took over. He had to get rid of the evidence. He dragged the bodies across the hallway, from room 703 into his own apartment, room 704. It was a macabre parade, moving the dead from their home to his, right under the noses of the other sleeping neighbors. Once the bodies were in his bathroom, he began the gruesome work of dismemberment. He spent the next day, February 11th, systematically cutting the bodies into smaller pieces that could fit into garbage bags. He separated the flesh from the bone, flushed soft tissue down the toilet, and packed the larger remains into black plastic sacks. For the head and heavy limbs of one of the sisters, he ran out of black bags. He looked around his apartment and grabbed the old, woven white bag from his college days, the bag that would eventually lead the police to his door. Over the next few nights, he used his motorcycle to ferry the bags to the wasteland in Liangqing district, dumping them like common trash. He then returned to the sisters' apartment, room 703, with a bucket and a mop. He scrubbed the floor. He wiped the door handles. He meticulously cleaned every surface, erasing the physical traces of his crime. He thought he had committed the perfect murder. He even inserted himself into the investigation, creating the masked man to misdirect the police. He watched from his window as the police chased false leads, feeling a surge of superiority. He had finally succeeded at something, but he had been too arrogant. He had kept the woven bag, and he had forgotten to clean the drain. On February 25th, 2009, the handcuffs finally clicked around the wrists of Lan Xincheng, the helpful neighbor from room 704, the university graduate, the masked man witness, and the grieving community member was formally charged with the triple homicide of Tan Jiami, Tan Yishan, and Tan Xiaoping. The arrest sent a shockwave through the city of Nanning that rivaled the initial discovery of the bodies. The monster was not a gang member or a drifter. He was the son of a government official living right next door. Once the confession was secured and the physical evidence locked down, the legal process moved with the swift, unforgiving efficiency characteristic of the Chinese judicial system in capital cases. On July 3, 2009, Lan Xincheng stood before the Nanning Intermediate People's Court to answer for his crimes. The courtroom was packed. The Tan family, shattered and mourning, sat in the gallery, desperate for justice. Across from them sat Lan's parents, the weight of their son's actions likely crushing the very family reputation they had tried so hard to protect. Lan Xincheng, stripped of his civilian clothes and dressed in a prisoner's vest, looked nothing like the arrogant mastermind who had toyed with the police during the investigation. The cold, calculated demeanor he had maintained during his initial interviews had evaporated. Standing before the judge, realizing the gravity of his situation, the killer crumbled. In a display that many observers found pitiable and infuriating, Lan broke down in tears. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking as he begged the court for leniency. He apologized to the Tan family. He apologized to his parents. He apologized to society. He claimed that he had lost his mind in a moment of passion, that the pressure of his life had caused him to snap, and that he was not truly an evil person. However, the prosecution painted a different picture. They laid out the facts. The premeditation of cutting the power, the methodical binding of the victims, the sexual assault, and the cold-blooded decision to strangle them one by one to eliminate witnesses. They pointed to the gruesome, days-long process of dismemberment and the calculated disposal of the remains. They highlighted his attempts to frame Wu Zhaoyi and his fabrication of the masked man suspect. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecution argued. It was a crime of envy, entitlement, and extreme cruelty. The judges agreed. The court found that Lan Xincheng's actions were extremely vile, his methods cruel, and the consequences grave. There was no room for mercy. The verdict was delivered with a heavy finality. Lan Xincheng was sentenced to death. Lan appealed the decision, clinging to life. The legal battle dragged on for another year. Finally, on July 22, 2010, the High People's Court of the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region rejected his appeal. The original sentence was upheld. Lan Xincheng, the boy who felt like a failure because he could not meet his father's expectations, had succeeded only in securing his own execution. But as the case closed, one final, twisting detail emerged, a revelation that turned this case from a gruesome tragedy into a psychological study of modern evil. During the investigation, police and cyberforensics experts had been monitoring the online discourse surrounding the dismemberment horror. They recalled the specific forum user who had tipped the scales of the investigation, the user who had argued against the gang theory and urged the police to look for a neighbor living in the same building. This user had gone by the screen name Keenan, likely a reference to Detective Conan, a popular anime sleuth. The comment had been so insightful, so accurate, that it had effectively guided the police back to Jiazhou Garden, when they were lost chasing the loan shark in Shanxi. After Lan's arrest, investigators traced the IP address of Keenan. The results were chilling. The user, Keenan, was Lan Xincheng himself. The killer had not just watched the investigation, he had directed it. Sitting in his apartment, perhaps just feet away from where he had butchered 3 women, Lan had logged onto the internet to discuss his own crime. He had posed as an armchair detective, analyzing the murder he had committed. Psychologists and criminologists have long debated why he did this. Was it the ultimate act of narcissism? Was he taunting the police, seeing how close he could push them to the truth without getting caught, like a pyromaniac returning to watch the fire station? Or was it something more complex? Some analysts believe it was a subconscious cry for help, a manifestation of the guilt that eventually broke him in the interrogation room. Perhaps, deep down, the burden of the secret was too heavy, and the Keenan persona was his way of steering the authorities toward him because he wanted it to end. He wanted to be caught, but he was too cowardly to turn himself in. By pointing the finger at a neighbor, he was practically handing the police the key to his door. Regardless of the motive, this digital footprint remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It highlighted a terrifying reality of the modern age. The monsters are not just living next door. They are commenting on our posts, sharing our theories, and hiding in the anonymity of the web. The legacy of the Jiazhou Garden murders left a deep scar on the city of Nanning. For a long time, the name Jiazhou Garden became synonymous with horror. The apartment complex struggled to shed its dark reputation. Tenants moved out, and for years, locals would lower their voices when walking past the building. It shattered the illusion of safety that many urban residents clung to, the idea that locking your door and living in a high-rise protected you from the violence of the world. The case also drew immediate, dark comparisons to another of China's most infamous crimes, the 1996 Nanjing University dismemberment case. In that older cold case, a 19-year-old student named Diao Aiqing was murdered and cut into over 2,000 pieces, her remains scattered across the city of Nanjing. The precision of the cuts in that case suggested a doctor or a butcher, much like the police initially suspected in the Tan sisters' case. However, the key difference lies in the resolution. The Nanjing killer was never found. That shadow still hangs over Nanjing, a ghost that has never been exorcised. In contrast, the Nanning police, aided by forensic science, persistence, and perhaps the killer's own hubris, managed to close the book on Lan Xincheng. Justice, though it could not bring back the vibrant lives of Jiami, Yashan, and Xiaoping, was served. The Tan family was spared the agony of an unsolved mystery, even if they were forced to endure the pain of the truth. Lan Xincheng's story serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can fester behind closed doors. It is a story of how unchecked verbal abuse, familial pressure, and a sense of inadequacy can warp a human mind until it views others not as people, but as objects, to be destroyed to soothe a bruised ego. The three sisters, who came to the city with dreams of success and happiness, became the innocent victims of a man's war with himself. As the sun sets over Nanning today, the city has moved on. The markets are busy, the lights of the Heping shopping center still shine, and young women still laugh together as they walk home. But for those who remember the winter of 2009, the shadow of room 703 lingers, a testament to the fragility of life and the terrifying randomness of evil. This case is a terrifying example of the call coming from inside the house. It forces us to ask, how well do we really know the people living on the other side of our walls? Lan Xincheng seemed like a polite, educated neighbor, yet he was harboring a deadly rage. What do you think about the canon twist? Do you believe Lan Xincheng posted that clue out of arrogance, trying to outsmart the police, or was it his guilty conscience trying to get caught? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you found this deep dive compelling, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more true crime investigations from around the world. Stay safe and keep your doors locked.